Last episode, we talked about how new technology and contextual factors drove Europeans fast and furious to the New World. State-sponsored voyages like Columbus's literally changed the course of history. Prior to Columbus's arrival in the New World, the two hemispheres existed in isolation from one another, developing on independent paths into two completely different worlds with their own flora and fauna and ways of living. Interestingly, because Eurasia is largely situated horizontally and the Americas are largely situated vertically, Eurasia had much more commonality geographically and in terms of climate and animals as opposed to the Americas, which developed in more isolated pockets. Unfortunately, because the Americas had been so much more isolated than the Afro-Eurasian world, the joining of the hemispheres would have catastrophic results for Amerindian populations and largely beneficial results for Afro-Eurasian populations. The unintentional blending of the hemispheres' biological material is something that has come to be called the Columbian exchange. The term coined by noted historian Alfred Crosby in his landmark book by the same name, published in 1972. Before Crosby published this book, people didn't really think about environmental history, and they also really didn't think about the role that the arrival of the Europeans and their germs played on native populations and societies in the Americas. These ideas were further popularized by American geographer and historian Jared Diamond in his famous book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, in which he hypothesizes that Europe's geography led to its development of hardy immune systems, weaponized gunpowder, and superior weapons technology that allowed them to sweep over the empires of the Americas with relatively few resources at their disposal. But let's back up and talk more about the Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange can largely be separated into four components: the transfer of crops, domestic animals, people, and diseases. First, let's talk about crops. Most of the agricultural transfers between the hemispheres were a one-way street. Europeans took American crops and transferred them to Eurasia, where they were extremely beneficial to Afro-Eurasian populations. Potatoes, in particular, which grew in poor soil, are very calorie dense and keep for long periods of time, and they resulted in a massive population boom in Europe. Sweet potatoes became increasingly popular in Asian cuisine, causing a population boom there. And cassava, or yucca, was transferred to West Africa, where it became a staple of the diet in many regions. Side note: the resulting dependence on potato agriculture in Northern Europe, particularly Ireland, and especially among the poor population, is responsible for the potato famine of 1845, 1846, and lastly 1848, which caused millions of Irish people to die and millions more to migrate to the United States and Canada. Other American crops like beans, corn, tomatoes, squash, chocolate, and several varieties of peppers altered European diets as well. Think about it. There were not tomatoes in Italian food before the Columbian Exchange. Crops brought by the Europeans varied. The first agricultural products to arrive were wheat and grapes, so that the Spanish could make what they needed to conduct a Catholic mass. After the establishment of plantation agriculture, Eurasian crops like sugarcane, citrus, barley, rye, bananas, and coffee were transported to be grown in large quantities, some as cash crops by imported slave labor or forced labor by Native Americans. We'll get into this in a later episode. Africans brought to the Americas against their will did manage to bring varieties of rice with them from West Africa, which ended up working very well in the lowlands of coastal Louisiana and South Carolina. Next were domestic animals. Domestic animals were also a one-way street, but this path went the opposite direction as crops did. Europeans brought over most livestock animals: pigs, cows, horses, goats, sheep, chickens, and so on. Americans didn't really have much in the way of domesticated animals to offer. The largest domesticated animal in the Americas were llamas, and they were notoriously weak and they spit. Don't tell Mrs. Perez. She loves llamas. I've been to a llama farm with her. The alpacas were nicer. The pigs, cows, and other food animals completely altered the American landscape. Large grazing herds of domestic livestock hadn't been a thing before, and pigs rooted up the landscape and bred like crazy. This caused serious environmental damage when it was coupled with the new intensive agricultural practices for grains that the Europeans introduced. Next is people. The majority of Europeans who came over in the early years of contact between the hemispheres were male. Their purpose, especially for the Spanish and the Portuguese, wasn't actually to settle, but to conquer, hence the fact that we call them conquistadors. And not only that, but also to extract precious raw materials. So women and families weren't a thing. But it turns out that men without women become men who find women where they go. And so there were a lot of relations between European men and Native women, some consensual and some not. This meant that people who were mixed between European, Native American, and later African ancestry were born, and they had never been born before. Finally, and most significantly, we come to disease. Because Afro-Eurasia had been interconnected by all those trade routes we've learned about, diseases had been passed around pretty easily for millennia. Smallpox, measles, and yellow fever were endemic and well established in the Old World, but raged through the Amerindian community, who hadn't built up generations of antibodies against these diseases. For the most part, this was obviously an unintentional Holocaust. It's estimated that anywhere between 50 and 90% of the native population died of disease, completely undermining the social, political, and economic structure that they had established prior to the arrival of Europeans. In both the Aztec and the Inca empires, both men who were ruling at the time of Spanish contact had only gained their throne because the leader who'd held it before them had died of a European-introduced disease. In the case of Atahualpa, the last Inca emperor, the death of his predecessor from smallpox kicked off a vicious civil war that weakened the empire and destabilized it, just in time for Pizarro to arrive with his firearms and steel weapons and armor. This also altered the way that Europeans viewed Amerindian societies. When Cortez's men first saw the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, they were absolutely blown away by its beauty, size, grandeur, and architectural achievements. But as American civilizations collapsed under the pressure of what became known as the Great Dying, these cities turned into ghost towns, and the Amerindians increasingly became viewed as backward and less advanced, therefore less deserving of better treatment and more deserving of European conquest, when just decades before they had been the cause of Spanish awe. Going back to Crosby, with his innovative approach to history, he points out a few things. Zooming in on the Columbian exchange, he says, and I quote, "Migration of man and his maladies is the chief cause of epidemics. And when migration takes place, those creatures who have been in isolation longest suffer most, for the genetic material has been least tempered by the variety of world diseases. Among the major subdivisions of the species Homo sapiens, the American Indian probably had the dangerous privilege of the longest isolation from the rest of mankind." End quote. The great dying of the population of the Americas would have huge impacts. It would enable European colonization, the destruction of cultures and entire groups of people. The natives of Hispaniola and other large islands in the Caribbean, the Taino people, are currently extinct. American expansion into the West, the alteration of the American landscape, the development of Atlantic slavery to find a replacement labor source for the dead natives, and centuries of racism and brutality that would accompany it. Crosby also points out that history is really powered not by individuals, but by processes larger than individuals. Columbus started it, but inanimate microbes altered the course of history. And that's a big deal. We typically have been taught to see history as nothing but the biography of great men. How does the Columbian exchange fit into that? The single greatest change in world history is not a person, but millions of animals, plants, people, and germs that pushed, as Crosby would say, the seams of Pangea back together.